Excellent. Again, thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Elise from the Feed. I will be introducing our head nutrition coach and sports dietitian, Joey Hassett, in just a moment. Mike, thank you. Hillary, thank you for setting this up. We're from the Feed, so we are partners of the club where we provide store credit so that you guys can, stock up on your nutrition. We have lots of different brands coming in from overseas, as well as a new hydration that we just launched. So again, there's just such a huge variety of things that you can try and really explore, what may work for you. So again, thank you very much. We are going to get started. Joey, I will let you take it away. And thanks again.
Perfect. Thanks, Elise. And yeah, thanks for everyone for being here tonight. I'm just down in Denver. I work in our office in Broomfield, so not too far from most of you, I would imagine. But yeah, like Elise said, my name's Joey, and I'm the head sports nutrition coach and dietitian here at the Feed. And what that means to you guys as athletes and customers of the Feed is that you basically have unlimited access to me and my team. We're a small but mighty 3-person team, and we basically handle any sort of nutrition inquiry that comes in to us via email, call, text, whatever it may be. And we help a lot of athletes out, whether it's developing a fueling plan for races, or trying to figure out, what was it that caused that stomach issue in that last race, or, maybe this is all new to you. Maybe this is your first season of triathlon and you don't know where necessarily to start. People tell you X, Y, Z to eat or drink on the bike. Don't do this, do this. And I'm here to kind of help, navigate those somewhat murky waters of the world of sports nutrition. I know there's a lot of mixed messaging out there. And so, my goal really is to try and, disseminate any of the current research and, bring that to any of the athletes and, make that so that, you know what that means, and make it digestible and how it applies to maybe you as a triathlete, depending on, the distance that you're racing, or, your time goals, whatever it may be. And a little bit about me, I come from a triathlon background. I raced youth, junior, and U23 draft legal racing, and I raced that across the country and overseas. And so I have a pretty well in-depth knowledge, I would say, within the triathlon world. And then I did a lot of the collegiate racing, a lot of age group, non-draft legal racing, and the longest I've ever done is a 70.3, which is just last summer in Coeur d'Alene. And if you've never raced there, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful course. The water was absolutely frigid, but I think it just made me swim a little faster. But yeah, with that said, my primary passion really has always been cycling. And so I've put a lot of attention on that now. And I know I do a ton of the group rides up in the Boulder area. And I ride for a team based out of Denver. So you may see me around. If you do, just make sure to say hi. If you want to ride next to me and ask me a bunch of questions, feel free. I love it. Makes the rides go by even faster. But with all that said, tonight we're just going to dive into some of the basics of fueling and hydration around endurance sport, triathlon specifically. And then, at the end, we'll have some Q&A, some scenarios if, if time allows. I always like to put the Q&A kind of first, just because those questions I think are a little bit more important and pertinent to everyone here. And then, like Elise mentioned earlier on, this is all recorded. So, it allows you to afterwards go back, pause the video, write down anything, re-listen to anything. So, there's lots of tools that are going to be presented here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All righty. And can everyone see this all right? Alrighty, so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started here. So like I mentioned, tonight we're going to cover hydration, fueling, and then some scenarios and a little bit of Q&A. Feel free to drop questions in the chat as they come up. I probably won't get to them until the end, but if I can, I will make sure to open them up as we go through here. So to start things off, hydration. This is something that we obviously all know that has always been kind of drilled into us ever since, maybe we played, t-ball or, any sort of team sport growing up. It's always been, make sure to stay hydrated, make sure to drink water. But what does that really mean? Like, do I just drink water? Do I drink Gatorade? It varies so much person to person, and it means something different really to everyone. And so, hydration is going to be a mix of water, so your fluids, and then of course electrolytes, which we have a lot of different electrolytes that are important, but the primary one we'll talk about tonight is sodium, since that's the main one that we tend to lose in our sweat. And so with that being said, the research points in kind of multiple directions when it comes to hydration and kind of what the athlete needs. So we call this kind of the hydration debate. And so you'll see I have two products listed out here, one being Precision Fuel and Hydration, the other one being Morton. I'm sure a lot of you maybe have seen these around or maybe heard about them. But the reason I use these two is because they both have two different kind of thoughts or theories as towards what the athlete needs. So Precision believes that the athlete needs to replace that sodium that's being lost along with their carbohydrates throughout training and racing at high amounts. Whereas Morton's on the other end, where they're under the research and theory that our bodies have enough stored electrolytes that we don't necessarily need to worry too much about what we need to replace. And here at the feed, our team really likes to kind of just fall in the middle. We're kind of that middleman. So we know both ends are true, but we know that everyone's so different. And so that's why, one great thing is, like Elise mentioned, we have a new hydration product that's coming out called Mortal Hydration, and they have a margarita flavor that is phenomenal. Highly recommend it once you can get your hands on it. But we fall in the middle, meaning no matter what who the athlete is, we like to dive into questions like, how much do you sweat? Is your sweat really salty, or is it just a lot of sweat? Maybe you don't sweat a lot at all. So these are the kind of questions that we like to prompt with to determine, all right, what type of product might be best for you, depending on your current training conditions, maybe your predicted race conditions, and these will change throughout the season. Obviously, being here in Colorado, it's really cold. And, even when we can get outside, we aren't sweating nearly as much. So maybe we don't need as much electrolytes as we do, in the middle of July on a long Saturday ride up north or something along those lines. And so, a good rule of thumb here, excuse me, is that, any exercise that's 60 minutes or less, water's typically going to be okay for most individuals. I like to aim for at least 16 ounces. So, just like one water bottle. And this, again, varies person to person quite a bit, but this is a good baseline and a kind of good rule of thumb to start with. Now, say you're training indoors and it's really hot, you don't have the fan blowing on you, and you're sweating a lot, then we might want to consider throwing in a little bit more electrolytes, and I'll touch on that in the next slide. But along the lines of just a kind of general rule of thumb, anything over 60 minutes, we're going to want to consider 16, sometimes up to 32 ounces of fluid, just depending on the conditions. And then that's where we start to really look at, how much electrolytes do you need individually, and what are the ways that we can achieve that, whether it's through the added in your water bottle, maybe it's like a electrolyte chew or a capsule that you just take that has sodium in it. So lots of options there. And so this is the table that, our team has kind of worked on developing that tries to bring all of the hydration research and science and kind of just bring it into one visual that's relatively easier to follow and a good just point of reference to, some people print it out and have it with their, hydration products. So they know, okay, I'm riding for 3 hours today, so I should use X, Y, and Z. And so with this table here on the left side of the screen, we like to reference towards things as low, medium, or high electrolyte concentration. And you can see those values up in the top right. And those electrolyte compositions are going to be in terms of milligrams of sodium. And so when looking at this table here, we have the time or duration across the x-axis, so across the bottom, or I guess the top there. And then on the y-axis, we have the intensity, so how hard that effort is going to be. And so starting in the very bottom left corner of this table, we have a low intensity effort, which is going to be that conversational pace, one of those easier training rides. Maybe it's just kind of a recovery run, nothing that's, exerting you too much. And if it's less than an hour, that's where we just, like I mentioned earlier, just the water's typically fine, unless there's some more extreme conditions such as the heat or humidity that we run into more in the Midwest. But as we move across that table, even at that low intensity, we hit the 45 minutes to 90 minutes, all the way up to 3 hours. We start to look at, all right, how much water plus what should I consider for electrolyte replacements? And this where it starts to become really important, because if we allow our body to become dehydrated, we know in terms, most people, understand that dehydration is just the lack of fluids in there, but in our body, but it also has to do with that imbalance that starts to occur from electrolytes. And I'm sure many of you guys have experienced muscle cramps. And typically a muscle cramp is best described as, our muscles slide side to side, nice and smooth. And then once they start to get dehydrated, they almost get sticky, and when they slide and they contract and they get really tight, they don't want to release, and the release won't happen, and it cramps. And that's due to an imbalance of electrolytes most of the time. And so to avoid that, we obviously want to make sure that we're replenishing those correctly throughout exercise. And so that's where this table can start to come in handy, depending on, like I mentioned, intensity and duration. And so as we move up through the table, you'll see that the amount of water will slowly increase depending on the intensity. But the main thing that's really increasing as you move through the medium to high intensity out to that kind of 3 hour mark is going to be the concentration of electrolytes that you need. I was at a race this past summer here in Colorado, up in Fort Collins, and it was super hot that day. And a lot of people, including myself, did not plan properly as to the concentration of electrolytes we would need. And so lots of people were out there cramping, lots of people were having to drink excessive amounts of water, but it wasn't necessarily doing the trick, because they were just sweating buckets, and it was, all very heavily concentrated in sodium. And so these are all these factors that we kind of live and learn from, and always need to kind of consider as we are planning our training. And being at altitude is just another factor that we have to take into account. Higher altitude, the higher we go, the more it's going to affect our hydration status, and the more we need to pay attention to it due to us just dehydrating quicker. And so we could talk all day about hydration, and we could nerd out about all the numbers. But like I mentioned, this is one that's really fun to kind of dive into with some of those probing questions to see what is it you need based on time of year, the races you have planned, and all those good things. And so next, it goes right along with hydration, but your fueling. They kind of go hand in hand. A lot of the time, everything's kind of mixed into one bottle, especially for triathlon when it's a little bit more cumbersome to carry gels or choose with you on, say, the run. And so when we say fuel, a lot of things will kind of come to mind for athletes as to what they've maybe used in the past, or like I mentioned earlier, maybe what people told you they use. But fuel it means a lot of things, right? Outside of training, it means just adequately fueling your body with, a well-balanced diet, good proportions of carbohydrates, fat, protein, eating a variety of color to get all your vitamins and minerals. That's the dietitian answer, right, of how to fuel outside of training. But when it comes to in training, it's a little bit more specific, but then again, it's a little bit more kind of umbrella, because when we talk about fueling, for the longest time, talked about calories per hour and how much you kind of need to keep you going. and keep you from hitting that dreaded wall or bonking. And for the longest time, when we talked about calories per hour as anywhere between 250 to maybe 350 calories per hour, it really varied depending on who was kind of relaying the message. And since then, science has continued to evolve. And as it's evolved, our verbiage has also changed. And the way we address fueling during workouts and training is gone to from calories per hour to grams of carbohydrate per hour. And that's simply just due to the fact that we know our body's primary energy source is going to be carbohydrate. And so we want to figure out how much carbohydrate we need every hour based on, again, duration and intensity. And from there, we start to play with, all right, what works best for an individual, as well as how much can that individual consume now and how much can they consume on, or how much do we want them to consume on race day? And I'll talk a little bit about the amounts. But just probably about 20 years ago, as sports nutrition started to come to kind of the forefront of training and performance, it was originally thought that the body could only take in 30 grams of carbohydrates per hour, which is like one gel for some companies. Some companies, it's not even a full gel. It might be like half of a bar. So it's not very much fuel at all. Now, that's enough to allow you to kind of keep going hour after hour, but not by any means at a higher intensity where you're expending more energy. And as science continued to evolve, they started to do more research and see how much is it that the human body can actually use every hour. And it started to shift from 30 then to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So now we're talking, 2 to 3 gels an hour. And over time, again, shifting more, it's now up to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So now we're talking a pretty substantial amount of fuel every hour. And that's, again, all based off of intensity and duration and, environmental factors, as well as what you can tolerate as an individual. But with that being said, if look at if you're, like to kind of nerd out about any of this stuff like myself, you'll start to see that some of the pros are talking about this and some of the professional teams are talking about this and what they're doing. And you'll hear that they're doing 120 or 150 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And, that's just an absurd amount of fuel. It's also very expensive to do. However, we scientifically know that we can do at least 90, and a lot of the research is starting to show that we can do more, but there's nothing really set in stone as to how much. And so we kind of like to leave that up to the professional athletes to dive into and kind of play around with in the research realm and, do what we know works for now. And so with that being said, we have a similar chart here to kind of help plot out, all right, how much fuel do I need based on my event, my training session, and how hard it's going to be. And, you'll see that, and again, in the bottom left, it's low intensity for, roughly 45 minutes. No need to have necessarily any fuel. That's where we just talk about making sure that you get an adequate source of carbohydrates prior to training. And I can touch on that briefly here at the end. But, our bodies have enough reserve of what's called glycogen. Glycogen is our primary energy source when it comes to endurance training. It's the most readily available fuel for our muscles and our brain and for overall body function. So, we have enough of that stored between our muscles and our liver to provide us energy for about 90 minutes. Now, if we didn't take anything in and we went to a maximal effort for 90 minutes, once we start getting past that point, we're really going to start feeling the effects of it where, you're going to start to get a little bit dizzy, or maybe you're going to get nauseous. Your performance is going to significantly decrease because you aren't going to be able to hold that same threshold that you were holding prior because you've depleted all that fast acting energy, if you will. And now your body's relying more so on proteins and fats that are stored within our body. And those take a lot more energy from our body to be converted into usable energy. And that slow conversion to energy really takes its toll on that kind of higher end, say 80% effort output. And so now you're only maybe doing 50 or 40%, which is, pretty large, especially if you're talking in terms of maybe a 2-hour race. If we're talking in terms of, a 10-hour race, it's not quite as drastic. However, we still don't want to reach that point necessarily because it's pretty uncomfortable and it's sometimes even hard for people to just perform a normal task, and it really impacts the physiological aspects of our body. And so that's where we start to look at, all right, we can just take in a little bit of fuel during these lower efforts. And so say you're headed out for, again, for, an easy, mid to longer ride. You're going to be out there for 2 hours, but you're just chatting with your friends. No one's gonna, push you up the hill or anything like that. You can aim to take in roughly that 30 to 45 grams of carbohydrates an hour. And what that would look like would be something as simple as maybe like just one gel per hour, or, there's drink mixes. Scratch Labs is, a local company, and they make an excellent drink mix that has electrolytes and carbohydrates in it. And you just mix that up in your bottle, and you could have roughly one bottle per hour. There's lots of options, on those easier days. I like to opt for some faster acting carbohydrates, such as the Scratch Labs in my bottle. But, if you're going to be out there for 3 or 4 hours, you might want some, substantial food. So whether it's stop at the little convenience store, is it up in hygiene, or carry a peanut butter and jelly with you. That's one of my favorites if I'm going to kind of go off the grid. And those are the peanut butter and jelly, or that pastry is going to be a little bit slower burning, but it's going to provide you a sustained source of fuel still. Now, as we move up in intensity, I wouldn't necessarily recommend those slower sources of burning fuel, primarily just because they are going to start to lead to possible GI distress, because they're going to sit in the stomach, but you're still going to be pushing really hard. And that combination can really throw people for a loop. And there's, a time and place for how to use the solid foods. And I'll talk about that here in a second. But as we kind of move up from low to medium intensity, you'll see that the amount of carbohydrates to take in per hour starts to increase as well. And so, we go from not really needing much at all to all of a sudden needing, 60 grams of carbohydrates throughout a 90-minute workout, or, up to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour for these 1.5 to 3 hour workouts. And the more fuel is just there to essentially complement the extended duration of that effort. And as we get into that high intensity, that additional fuel where you see that 60 or 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, that's there to continue to complement, as I was talking about earlier, the high intensity effort. It's similar to like a race car where you have to put high octane fuel in it. You have to put high octane fuel in your body in order for it to continue to perform at its best for as long as you want it to perform, which are, usually multiple hours on end. And so, with that being said, I would never recommend anyone to, jump straight into giving themselves 60 or 90 grams carbohydrates per hour. You're just, asking for a recipe for an upset gut. But, we build up to it, and we call it training your gut, which is essentially over time. Really, this off-season time is the best time, especially if you say Oceanside, I heard, is, one of the races coming up for some of you guys, but is, in these winter miles, whether it's outside running, on the indoor trainer, outside riding, doing any sort of brick sessions, anything like that, that's where we start to incorporate this fuel into some of those longer workouts to, one, figure out, what it is that you like from a flavor, texture, what sits well in your stomach, to, all right, now that I've figured out some of the products that I enjoy using, now I need to start increasing the amount that I'm using in these harder workouts or during these longer sessions. So that way you start to kind of build up a tolerance as well, or not necessarily tolerance, but you start building up essentially the ability, your body starts to get used to the amount of fuel that you're putting into it. And it's like, okay, I know that you're giving me 60 grams of carbs every hour. So I know I need to work this fast in order to break them down and digest them. And so that digestion process is all dependent too on then the source of carbs. And like I mentioned earlier, solids, and fats and protein in there. So if you're going to be doing, say, an Olympic distance triathlon, most of the time we're going to be okay using just carbohydrates as our fuel source throughout that event. On the bike, you might be able to throw in some sort of bar, such as like a Morton bar or like a Honey Stinger waffle that's almost exclusively carbohydrate. It's going to be a little bit slower burning, but it's not going to be as slow burning as, say, fat and protein. But say you're going to be out there for 6 hours or 10 hours, then we start to look at, all right, how can we fuel while on the bike is the primary place that we'll use these fuel sources, because we obviously aren't running and we aren't jostling our stomach. So this is really the easiest time to fuel up. And we kind of always joke that in endurance sports, especially these longer efforts, are almost an eating competition. It's who can stay on top of their fueling and who can really put in the most fuel, tolerate it, and utilize it. And so by incorporating, something such as Cliff Bars, an easy one that comes to mind, on the bike, say, 2 hours into a 4 hour bike ride, then that's going to give your body enough time to start to break down some of that fuel. But it's still going to provide you a little bit more slower release of energy, while on top of it, you're still adding in the carbohydrates needed to keep you going hour after hour without really allowing yourself to get too hungry. And it's really a fine line. This works for a lot of people, but it definitely doesn't work for everyone. So that's why I always, say, like, make sure to practice this in training, practice it multiple times. It's similar to your transitions, right? Like, you'll see people out there that just absolutely fly through transition. And it's clear that they have practiced that multiple times or they've raced just a lot. And then you'll see people out there that are kind of struggling through transition. And it's very clear that they've never practiced that, whether it's putting your helmet on with cold fingers or, fumbling with your running shoes. Those are the sorts of things that, we practice a couple of times outside of racing, just so when it comes to race day, it's, natural. It's, muscle memory, and we don't have to think about it too much when we're already exhausted from being out there for hours on end. And so, that's where, myself and our nutrition team really can kind of come in to play for you guys and really help navigate what it might work best for you. And, it's a lot of trial and error. We call it nutritional tinkering, where it's, here's a couple of products that we recommend based on, what you've told us. Let us know your thoughts. If you hate them, tell us. And if you love them, let us know. And, we can provide recommendations that are similar. And I think between all of us, we've tried just about everything that we have here at the feed. So, and I always like to tell people, like, if I've never tried it, I just go out to the warehouse and I grab it and I try it for you, and I'll give you my honest feedback. And sometimes, people are like, oh, that's the one I want, if this is what you say. So, lots of really cool options and opportunities there when it comes to fueling. And so with all that fueling knowledge there, I know it's a lot, but I just wanted to provide a couple examples here as to kind of our thought processes when it comes to fueling on the bike or fueling for a long day. And so in the bottom left here, some of you guys might recognize the individual. It's Lachlan Martin. He's a professional cyclist, primarily in the off-road scene now with the Lifetime events. However, he raced the World Tour scene and has done lots of other really big multi-day rides and races. And you can see, obviously, there looks like he's bike packing. So he has a frame bag on, he's a handlebar bag on. But the handlebar bags in particular, I know they sometimes look dorky, but I promise you, if you're out there for 5+ hours, it's a great way to store some extra layers and a couple extra snacks, and you always thank yourself for it. So it's just a way to, obviously carry additional fuel. This top left picture is a picture from this previous summer when I was getting ready to head out for a really long day on the bike. And, you can see there's lots of variety there, from the types of drink mix that I'm going to be using to the gels, as well as, there's some solid foods in there. So this is obviously, this is probably like an 8 or 10 hour day. And, provides a lot of variety, but it also helps provide some more sustained energy, helps provide a little bit of caffeine, some additional electrolytes. And I like to lay it out and chunk it into hour sections, just so I know how much I need every hour. And I make sure I don't leave the house with not enough. The bottom right is probably a more familiar scene to most currently, and it's that, indoor trainer setup. And whether you use, a trainer specific stand, I use a music stand to hold all my stuff. But you have your bike set up, and I always recommend, make sure to get on your bike and you have everything you need, because it's always a pain in the butt to get off your bike and go upstairs to fill more water bottles or get more food, unless you have a really nice roommate or partner that will, you can yell up to them and they'll bring it to you. But you can see here, this is another great opportunity to try different products that you think you might enjoy for your race and harder training days. When you're indoors, it gives you a little bit more time to think about that gel or that chew or that drink mix, because you can kind of sit up and you don't have to worry about, taking your hands off the bars and crashing or anything. So you can eat it, you can see how it feels in your mouth, how it tastes when, you're going hard. And then again, how it sits in your stomach, which is the main thing we're worried about. We want to make sure that it sits nicely in the stomach and it digests well, it doesn't cause bloating, or, it doesn't feel like it's just sitting there. So again, the indoor season is, good for not just base miles, but to also really dial in some of that nutrition. And then in the top right, I'm sure a lot of you guys have probably seen this at races, but it's just a way to tape on gels to your bike essentially. So this is a strategy I always use, especially in, draft legal racing, and even, half Ironman efforts, where you don't necessarily want to have to think too much about what you need. And so on each gel, I always recommend just writing down on the gel in Sharpie what hour or what time increment it is you're going to take it. So that way you get on the bike and you start riding, and every time your bike computer hits 20 minutes or 30 minutes, you see that on the bike computer and you need to eat a gel, and you can just tear it off and eat it, and then put the wrapper in your pocket or in your jersey, and kind of just continue on down the top tube. Then it keeps you a little bit more accountable to your fueling, and it also makes it a little bit safer. I know some people aren't as comfortable taking their hands off the handlebar and reaching in a pocket, so this makes it much more accessible, uh, especially while you're going fast and there's people around you. This is a great strategy I usually recommend to a lot of athletes. So, if it comes down to, fueling strategies or how to carry your nutrition, definitely just reach out and, let me know what you're doing. And a lot of times I'll ask kind of odd questions as to what year, make, and model is your bike. And I can look it up and determine what kind of carrying capacity you might have, and, develop your fueling strategy based around your bike. And then when it comes to the run portion, we always, want to figure out, all right, what works best when we're jostling our stomach, and we just it came off of maybe anywhere between an hour to 6 hours of riding our bikes. Now we have to run for quite a while. So determining what works best then while we're running is always going to be different for the most time than what works best on the bike. And so a lot of people, when it comes to the run, are going to prefer gels and prefer drink mix and fluids, just because they're easier to eat and drink while moving. And the fluid carbohydrates, or the liquidy carbohydrates, such as in drink mix and gels, are going to digest and absorb into our blood system much faster than, say, a chew or a solid, such as like a Morton bar. Those take longer to break down. They sit in the stomach a little bit longer. So they're not necessarily the go-to when it comes to running. And again, this is very individualized. I know some people absolutely despise carrying anything while they run, especially like a water bottle, a jogging bottle. But I'm personally one of them. So instead, in these longer races, I figure out a way to strategically attach gels to my race belt, or before I leave T2, you shove gels into your jersey pocket and you have them for you while you're on the run. And then we just plan ahead and we know in our heads where the aid stations are and roughly how long it's going to take us to get there. And, obviously there's a lot of planning that goes into your training and your training plans and then developing our nutrition plans. But planning for race day is all in of itself another, pretty big task that I always like to tell people not to take too lightly because, I personally am a big Excel spreadsheet person. And so breaking, a race down into 20-minute increments based on how fast I think I can go is a great way to visualize, all right, I need to take nutrition at these spots, and I know that there's going to be aid stations at these spots. And you do that a week or so ahead of time, and then you kind of study it like it's, for an exam. Then come race day, you don't necessarily have to think about it too much. And as you get going, that information starts to come back to you and you start to remember, oh, I'm an hour and a half in, there's going to be an aid station up here in 10 minutes, and you're on pace. And it's a great way to keep pace as well. And so those are kind of some fun ways to also, combine the performance and the nutrition side of things and really kind of dive into it all to really maximize that race day performance. And so I know I've been talking to you guys quite a bit, and I've thrown a lot of information at you. Before jumping into scenarios here, I wanted to see, see if I can open up this chat here. Perfect. All right, let's see if there's any questions out there. All right, so I'll start with this one in the chat here from Hillary, and then we'll kind of open up the floor to, questions that you guys might have, whether it's race specific, very individualized, whatever it may be. I'd love to kind of dive into them with the time remaining. But Hillary's question is, do electrolytes need changed based on humidity levels as well as heat? And the answer is absolutely, yeah. So it's, again, you'll hear me say it a million times, but it's so individualized, right? But a general rule of thumb when it comes to fluids and electrolytes is that as the heat and humidity increase, so do your electrolyte needs and fluid needs. Now, it's a double-edged sword if you add in carbohydrates to your drink mix, though. So if you're increasing the concentration of, say, your Scratch Labs drink mix by adding more scoops, the problem that we run into when it gets really hot is that we need more fluids and electrolytes, but if there's carbohydrates mixed into that bottle as well, we start to kind of toe that fine line of this is becoming too sweet, this is starting to hurt my stomach, but I'm also thirsty and I need to drink more. And so that's where some of it's kind of firsthand experience as to like learning what works best for you in the heat. But usually what I advise most athletes to do is, I had quite a few athletes that were raced Ironman Cozumel down in Mexico, which was obviously very hot and very humid. And so for them, they carried a water bottle that was exclusively water with a high concentration of electrolytes in it. So that way they could always take that and just take a small sip of it. And they're getting, a good dose of sodium. And then their other bottle between their arrow bars on their handlebars is a drink mix with carbs, electrolytes, and fluids. And so yeah, it's a different for everyone just depending on how much you sweat and if you're a salty sweater or not. But yeah, the humidity always kind of throws a wrench in things. And I was working with one of our professional triathletes last summer, and he was just getting back. Well, he was preparing for PTO Singapore, and then he got back from PTO Singapore. He said everything went really well except the heat and humidity. So it's not unheard of. And obviously the pros are still having issues with it as well. And so it looks like there's a few more questions rolling into the chat here. Let's see. So Nancy says that she's heard it's important to use a mix of different carbs for better absorption. For example, maltodextrin and sucrose. But if you use one type of sugar, such as dextrose or glucose, and are getting your 60 grams of carbs per hour, does it matter if they are from one sugar source or two? So that's a good question, and that's kind of my bad. I wish I would have covered that a little better here. Um, One thing that just to note is that a lot of these sports nutrition drinks and drink mixes kind of already do this for you without you knowing. And that's more so kind of gone with the evolution of science. But that's exactly correct, Nancy. So what Nancy's talking about there is that our bodies have what's called glucose glucose transporters, which means there are these little think of them as little cars that are parked on the walls of our small intestine. And when glucose enters into our small intestine, it gets in that car and it drives off into the body and goes to the respective areas to provide energy. However, there's only so many parking spots in our small intestine for those cars. And so if we have 30 parking spots for glucose, but we put in 40 glucose molecules, then there's these 10 extra ones that are going to be kind of floating around in the small intestine because there's no cars to take them to where they need to go. And what then, if that happens time and time again, after hour, what we start to develop is kind of what I term as gut rot. But people usually it's just like this GI distress and uncomfortableness where it feels like it's not digesting, or most people will start to get a little bloated. And really you start to kind of notice some of those performance declines. And that's just simply because those extra sugar molecules are just sitting in the small intestine and now they're slowly just getting digested rather than being used for energy. And so that's where a lot of these sports nutrition products start to add in different types of sugars because we have 30 parking spots for, say, glucose, but then maybe we have another 30 parking spots for fructose and then another 30 parking spots for maltodextrin. So all of a sudden we have 90 parking spots across the three different types of sugars, which means if we're adding in now a drink mix that uses all three types of sugars, once they get into that small intestine, they go to their respective cars and then they can still get transported throughout the body to the respective areas within to produce energy. So that energy is glycogen, and then that provides you, the ability to continue on. So yeah, when you look at labels, don't be alarmed when you see that it has, multiple types of carbohydrates, or, if it's all these sports nutrition drinks are going to have, say 20 grams of carbs, and then you look at the right below it, it says 20 grams of added sugar. Carbs and sugar are a synonymous term. They're both a carb is a sugar and a sugar is a carb, right? So that's what we're going to use because it's the fastest converting source of energy for these higher intensity efforts. I hope that answers your question, Nancy. Next question in the chat here, Alexis, does the grams of carbs have to stay the same throughout the entire race, independently of how tired I am? So this is a really good question, and this is one that we've really started to kind of play around a lot with our athletes that do these really kind of longer events. One thing that we've started to notice is that, and one thing that we know is when we start training or we start a race that's, say, 6 hours long, those first 2 to 3 hours, our body's really good at utilizing and breaking down all of the fuel that we provide it because our blood flow to our gut and our stomach is still relatively high. But as we start to fatigue and as we start to get longer into that event, the blood flow that has been going to our small intestine and our stomach starts to slowly decrease because it has to go to our working muscles and our brain. That's its primary source, or that's its primary goal, to keep energy flowing, essentially. Is it knows it needs your brain to work and it knows your muscles need to work, but everything else it doesn't need to work as well. And so when it starts pulling blood away from your gut and your stomach, we start to have a little bit slower digestion. And so we started to kind of play around with this tapering effect of fueling. This is a little bit more advanced when it comes to developing the fueling strategy, but definitely doable for a lot of people. But essentially what it means is that, for those first 3 hours where, you swam for maybe 45 minutes and then you got on the bike for another, 2 hours and 15 minutes, those during that time, we're going to be taking in, say, 90 grams of carbohydrate. And throughout the bike, we're still going to be doing 90 grams, 90 grams. And then once we get off the bike and we get into that run, then we're going to start looking at, all right, I've been fueling at 90 grams. I know my gas tank is really well topped off with fuel, but now that I'm on the run, I'm getting tired and it's a little bit harder to take in fuel. So then we can look at tapering back the amount of fuel that you're taking in from 90 to maybe 60 grams, maybe even, 50 or 45 grams, depending on the individual, because now you have enough fuel in your reserve tank to allow you to keep going as long as you're providing still this small dose of fuel every hour. And it's kind of complicated because that small amount is so different from person to person, depending on how fast your body uses carbs. But the shorter answer is yes, you can take in more at the beginning and less at the end, as long as it's this kind of steady, slow curve down. We don't want it to be like, I'm doing really well, I'm doing really well. And then all of a sudden, I'm not taking any fuel for the last 3 hours. By the time you get close to finishing that run, life is not going to be very fun. And you're gonna, swear that you never do another triathlon until you sign up for the next triathlon. So there's a lot that goes into there we go. A lot that goes into trying to develop that tapered fueling strategy for sure. All right. Other questions? These are good questions, guys. Does anyone want to share what they do for their triathlon fueling? Are you guys thinking about dinner?
Yes.
Well, I will say, as we kind of start to wrap up things here, but, oh, I guess I didn't start off by asking how many of you guys know what the feed is. Occasionally I will do some of these and, no one will have heard of the feed. But like Elise mentioned at the beginning, it's an online marketplace to, purchase all your sports nutrition needs. And then the nutrition services that we offer are 100% free, which is pretty cool. To try to get in with a one-on-one sports nutrition consultation with a dietitian is usually pretty expensive for private practice. And, the feed has kind of found a way to basically make that free to everyone, right? And so all you need to do is write in, whether it's to our email, which is just coaching@thefeed.com, or you can text us no matter what way you contact us, as long as you have a nutrition question in there, it will find its way to my inbox because our customer service team is a small team of 8 and they all know me and I know all of them. And anytime they see something, it's immediately directed over to our nutrition team and we will, dive into whatever questions it may be, whether super specific or very general. Let's see, a few more questions just rolled in here. Yeah, and Nancy mentioned she does, long distance cycling, and it is if you watch any of these videos on YouTube with a lot of the pro ultra gravel riders and stuff, it's eating is just a chore in and of itself on these long races, and I've slowly had to figure out what does and doesn't work, and what works at the beginning of the season doesn't work at the end of the season sometimes. So, don't be afraid to reach out if you run into roadblocks in the middle of the season. And a good question here too, for fueling recommendations for someone that has type 1 diabetes. This gets a little bit more specific. There's actually a few products that we carry that are kind of my go-tos for someone that has either type 1 or type 2. I know they're different. However, there's some generalities depending on the individual. The biggest thing that I tend to focus on, and definitely write me an email, and I will happily dive into this deeper with you, but focusing on lower glycemic index food products. So if you're looking at natural, like real food, that's like white rice, potatoes, anything that's starchy is typically a low glycemic index option. And then there's a few sports nutrition like gel companies. So there's one in particular called UCAN, just letter U followed by CAN. They use what's called their Live Steady starch. And it's a corn-based starch that has shown to be extremely low glycemic index, which just simply means that when it raises your blood sugar, it's very slow increase, which can be very beneficial for individuals that might have a hard time either keeping their blood glucose under control, or in the case of having type 1 diabetes, trying to match your insulin to that. It can be a little bit easier to do since you aren't going to get these rapid spikes and falls that can happen during exercise. But definitely write me an email and we can dive deeper into that for sure. Let's see. And then Jenna said she wrote a question in before this. I will check in on our Jenna, I will check in on our, if you wrote it on the forum take-in sheet, I should be able to see your question in there, and then I can follow up with you tomorrow on that, and I'll send you an email from our coaching email, just getting back to your question. But yeah, anyone else? Questions, concerns? Stay warm.
Yes. Thank you all so much for being here. Really, really appreciate the time and being able to support you guys. I will share the recording for Mike to hand out, and Hillary, as well as the presentation. So thank you. Thank you so much. We're here for you.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Joey.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you
You guys
guys.
have a great night. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.